Imagine you're sitting in a terminal right now. You look out the window at the runway. Everything looks calm, normal. Planes are landing smoothly, one after another. The terminal around you is bustling with activity. People moving through the concourse, checking their luggage, heading toward gates. And here's something remarkable. The baggage system is working perfectly. Skytrax, the organisation that rates airports around the world, has given this airport an award for baggage handling. Not once in its entire existence has this airport lost a piece of luggage. Not a single one. In an industry where baggage gets lost all the time, this airport has achieved something that seems almost impossible. Perfect baggage handling at a facility that processes thousands of bags every single day. Everything here looks like it's working exactly as it should. The infrastructure is solid. The operations are smooth. The airport feels permanent, stable, built to last for generations. But here's what you don't know as you're sitting there, watching planes land and passengers move through the terminal. The ground beneath your feet has dropped 4 stories since this airport opened. 4 stories. That's about 40 feet. Imagine standing on the roof of a 4-story building and then slowly sinking into the ground beneath it. That's what's happening here, except it's been happening gradually over 3 decades. Nobody really notices it day to day. But the measurements are clear. The island you're standing on is literally disappearing into Osaka Bay, 1 inch at a time. And here's the most remarkable part. The engineers who built this place knew this would happen. They predicted it. They planned for it. They just didn't expect it would happen this fast. They didn't expect the island would sink this dramatically. And they definitely didn't expect that keeping this airport operational would require solutions that no other airport in the world has ever had to invent. This is Kansai International Airport. It sits on an artificial island in the middle of Osaka Bay, Japan. The airport handles 28 million passengers every year. Every single year. That's over 76,000 people passing through this facility daily. The airport operates around the clock, 24 hours a day with no break in service. Planes are landing, taking off, being refueled and loaded constantly. The airport never stops. It can't stop. It's critical infrastructure for one of Japan's most important economic regions. But the reality underneath all of this smooth operation is extraordinary. Kansai International Airport is engaged in a losing battle with the ocean. It's sinking. It's being attacked by increasingly powerful typhoons. It's threatened by rising sea levels caused by climate change. And the people who run it are spending hundreds of millions of dollars every single year just to keep it from disappearing completely underwater. So here's the question that makes this story worth telling. Why would anyone build an airport in the ocean in the first place? Why would a country spend $20 billion to create an airport on an artificial island in the sea when they could just expand an existing airport on land? That seems insane. That seems like the worst possible engineering decision. But the answer is actually much more practical than you'd think, and it tells us a lot about how cities work, how decisions get made, and what happens when those decisions encounter reality. The story starts in the 1960s with a problem that seemed impossible to solve. In those days, Osaka International Airport, also known as Itami Airport, was drowning in traffic. The city of Osaka was booming. Japan was in the middle of its economic miracle. This was the period when the country rebuilt itself after World War II and became a technological and manufacturing powerhouse. Companies were thriving. Businesses were expanding. More people were travelling by air. The airport was handling more and more flights every year, but the airport had reached a breaking point. It was completely full. It couldn't accommodate any more flights. There was no room to expand. It couldn't add another runway. It couldn't build a bigger terminal. The airport had hit its absolute limit, and the city needed more capacity. This was a serious problem. A modern city needs a functioning airport. It needs to move goods. It needs to move people. Without it, the entire regional economy suffers. Now, you might think the solution was simple. Just expand the existing airport, add more runways, build a bigger terminal, make it bigger and better. But Osaka had a problem that made simple expansion impossible. The city had built itself completely around the airport. Schools surrounded it, hospitals, apartment buildings, residential neighbourhoods. The airport wasn't located outside the city like most airports are, sitting in a rural area or on the outskirts of town. No, this airport was integrated right into the city itself. Expanding it meant displacing people. It meant tearing down schools. It meant destroying hospitals and residential neighbourhoods. Thousands of people would have had to move. Families would have been displaced. Businesses would have shut down. And there was another problem: noise. Airports are loud. The sound of jet engines is intense. It disturbs sleep. It causes health problems. It affects people's quality of life. The neighbourhoods around Itami Airport were dealing with constant aircraft noise. The situation was so bad that one community group filed over 33,000 lawsuits against the airport. 33,000 individual lawsuits. People were desperate to get the airport moved or shut down because they couldn't tolerate living next to it anymore. So the city of Osaka was trapped. The airport was essential for the economy, but expanding it would devastate the surrounding communities. The airport needed more capacity. But the residents needed relief from the noise. These two needs were completely incompatible. They were in direct conflict. Nobody could figure out how to solve this problem because any solution that helped one group would hurt the other. So in the mid-1960s, someone in government or business, the exact person, has been lost to history. But it was probably someone in a planning meeting or a government office asked a question that would eventually change everything. What if we built a new airport somewhere else? Somewhere where it wouldn't bother anyone? The room probably went quiet. That's not a serious suggestion, people probably thought. You can't just build an airport wherever you want. You need land. You need infrastructure. You need access roads and rail lines and utilities. You can't just create an airport out of nothing. But someone pushed back. Someone said, "What about the bay? There's space in Osaka Bay. It's ocean. It's empty. There's nobody living there who would be disturbed by noise. Building an airport in the ocean. It sounds absurd. It sounds impossible." But here's the thing about Japan in the 1960s. Japan believed it could build anything. The country had just rebuilt itself from devastation. Japanese engineers and construction companies were known for their ability to tackle massive infrastructure projects. They had built high-speed trains, massive bridges, complex highway systems. The idea of building in the ocean wasn't completely crazy. It was ambitious, it was expensive, it was risky, but it wasn't impossible. So instead of dismissing the idea, the government actually studied it seriously. They looked at Osaka Bay, they examined the seabed, they brought in geotechnical experts, engineers who specialised in studying soil and rock and clay beneath the surface. They asked, what's down there? Is it stable? Can you build on it? What problems might we encounter? The answers came back. Yes, you can probably build an airport in the bay, but it will be complicated. The seabed has soft clay. There will be challenges. You'll need to be innovative. You'll need to spend a lot of money. But it's possible. And so, sometime around 1970, the decision was made. Japan would build a new airport on an artificial island in Osaka Bay. It would take years to plan. It would take years to construct. It would cost more money than anyone had ever spent on an airport before. But it would solve Osaka's problem. It would create a new airport, and it would keep the noise away from the residential neighbourhoods. In 1987, construction actually began. Engineers started building an artificial island in the middle of the bay. They would dredge material from the seabed, quarry rock from nearby mountains, and even ship earth in from China and Korea. They would dump hundreds of millions of cubic meters of material into the ocean. They would build seawalls. They would create something that had never existed before at this scale, a completely man-made island, engineered specifically to support an airport. The project attracted international attention. Engineers from around the world came to study what Japan was attempting. It became a symbol of Japanese engineering prowess. a monument to what was possible when you combined ambition, money, and engineering skill. The architect chosen to design the terminal building was Renzo Piano, an Italian architect who had designed the famous Pompidou Centre in Paris. Piano created a building that was unlike any airport in the world. A mile-long terminal with a curved roof that looked like an airplane wing. It was beautiful. It was elegant. It was poetry made of steel and concrete. By September 4th, 1994, the airport was ready. Kansai International Airport opened to great celebration. Japan had done something extraordinary. They had built an airport in the ocean. They had solved Osaka's impossible problem. The airport would provide the capacity the city needed. It would move the noise away from residential areas. It would be a symbol of Japanese innovation and engineering excellence. For the first few years, everything seemed perfect. The airport operated smoothly. Flights came and went. Passengers moved through the beautiful terminal. The baggage system worked flawlessly. Everything was going according to plan. But then, something started happening that nobody had fully anticipated. Something that would completely change the story, from one of triumph to one of crisis. Something that would force engineers to invent solutions that no other airport in the world has ever had to use. The island started sinking, not a little bit, a lot. And it was sinking much faster than anyone had predicted it would. That discovery would set in motion a chain of events that continues to this day. It would lead to hydraulic jacks, constant monitoring, billion-dollar maintenance costs, and ultimately, an uncomfortable question about whether this airport can survive for much longer at all. But that story, the crisis, the solutions, the ongoing battle with geology and climate, that's the next part of this journey. So let's talk about what it actually takes to build an airport in the ocean. This isn't something you can just improvise. You can't grab some concrete and steel, throw it in the water and hope for the best. You need something solid, something stable, something that can support massive runways with airplanes landing on them. Something that can hold a mile-long terminal building filled with thousands of people, thousands of tons of equipment, fuel tanks, cargo storage, all the infrastructure that keeps an airport running. You need actual ground, real solid earth beneath everything, and that's where the real engineering challenge begins. The location chosen for Kansai was Osaka Bay, about 5 kilometers, roughly 3 miles off the coast. This location wasn't random. It had been carefully selected because it was far enough from residential areas to eliminate noise complaints, but close enough to be accessible. The water there was between 18 and 20 meters deep. That's about 60 feet. Deep enough that you can't just wade out and build, but not so deep that it becomes an engineering nightmare. But here's where things get complicated. Beneath that 18 meters of seawater was another 20 meters of something very specific. Soft clay. Not regular dirt, not sand. Clay. Ancient clay that had been deposited on the seabed over thousands of years by rivers and natural geological processes. This clay had a particular problem. It was incredibly loose and saturated with water. It held about 70% water content. Think about that for a moment. Imagine wet clay that you've soaked in water until it's basically a thick paste. That's what they were dealing with. The engineers had a term for what would happen if you put a massive weight on top of this clay: subsidence. The clay would compress. It would squish down. The water would slowly squeeze out. The whole thing would settle. And when you're talking about placing a multi-billion-dollar airport on top of it, even a small amount of settling becomes a massive problem. So the engineers had to prepare the seabed. They had to make it stronger. They had to make it more stable. This preparation process would become one of the most ambitious geotechnical projects ever attempted. The first step was dredging. Engineers used dredges to remove the top layers of the most problematic clay. They took it out and transported it away. Then they drove massive steel piles deep into the seabed. These weren't little piles. These were enormous steel shafts driven down to help anchor everything and provide stability. But driving the piles created an unexpected problem. As the piles went down, they actually pushed the seabed up. The ground heaved upward around the piles. This was a phenomenon engineers call heave. This wasn't helpful. It meant the seabed was unstable in unpredictable ways. The engineers needed a different approach. That's when they implemented something called the sand drain method. This was a technique where they installed vertical pipes, 2 million of them, directly into the clay. 2 million. That's not a typo. 2 million individual sand drains. Each one a vertical pipe that would sit in the clay and slowly help water escape from the material. Here's how it works. Clay is made up of tiny particles. Water gets trapped between those particles. If you can remove the water, the particles can pack more tightly together. The clay becomes more solid. The sand drains provided a pathway for that water to escape. But the process is incredibly slow. Water doesn't rush out of clay. It moves grain by grain, molecule by molecule. It takes years. Sometimes decades. You can't speed it up without damaging the clay itself, so they had to wait. While the sand drains did their work, they started the next phase, adding landfill material. Imagine dumping an enormous amount of earth into the ocean. That's exactly what they did. Over several years, they brought in material from multiple sources. Some came from dredging Osaka Bay itself, the material they'd removed while preparing the seabed. Some came from quarries in the mountains around Osaka. Some came from construction sites in the region. And here's the surprising part. Some came all the way from China and Korea. They were literally importing earth from other countries to build an artificial island. The scale of this operation was staggering. 400 million cubic meters of fill material. To help you visualize that, imagine roughly 80 barges, each coming in carrying heavy loads of sand, gravel and rock, unloading and heading back for more. Over and over, year after year. The material would pile up in the bay, gradually creating an artificial landmass. This wasn't random dumping. The landfill had a specific structure. Different layers of material were carefully placed. Sand in some areas, gravel in others, larger rocks as well. Each layer had a purpose. Each layer was designed to help consolidate the clay beneath it and create a progressively more stable foundation. The weight of all this material, 400 million cubic meters, is incredibly heavy, pressed down on the seabed below. This pressure actually helped the consolidation process. The weight squeezed water out of the clay. It forced the clay particles to pack more tightly. It made the foundation stronger. But again, this process couldn't be rushed. Consolidation happens on geological time. Days turn into months. Months turn into years. While all this was happening, another critical piece of infrastructure was being built, the seawall. The seawall would protect the entire artificial island. It would prevent the ocean from washing over the island during storms. It would shield the airport from waves and storm surge. It had to be incredibly strong, incredibly well built, and incredibly durable. The seawall was constructed using rock and something called tetrapods. Tetrapods are concrete blocks that look like giant children's jacks, those metal toys with 6 interlocking points. Except these weren't toys. These were massive engineering structures. The engineers deployed 48,000 of them. 48,000 individual tetrapod blocks, each one interlocking with the others to create a protective barrier. The seawall stretched for kilometers around the entire perimeter of the artificial island. It would need to withstand typhoon waves, storm surge, constant water action, and the corrosive effects of salt water. The tetrapods were designed to interlock in a specific pattern so that even if one was damaged, the others would hold firm. It was redundancy and resilience built into the structure. By the time construction was complete, Japan had created something remarkable, the 3rd largest artificial island in the world. Only 2 other man-made islands are larger. Kansai's island was roughly 4 square kilometers in size. That's about 1,500 football fields put together. All of it completely artificial. All of it engineered. Not a single natural element on the entire island. Everything was imported, placed and compacted by human engineering. The island wasn't just an empty piece of land, though. Runways were constructed on it. Massive concrete surfaces designed to support the weight of enormous aircraft taking off and landing. Taxiways were built so planes could move around. A terminal building was constructed. Fuel facilities were installed. Power substations. Water treatment systems. Everything needed to run a modern airport. The terminal building itself was the centerpiece. Designed by Renzo Piano, it stretched for nearly 2 kilometers, almost a mile and a quarter. It had a distinctive curved roof that mimicked the shape of an airplane wing. The design was innovative and beautiful, but it was also structurally complex. All that length, all that curve, all that weight, all sitting on the unstable foundation below. By 1994, after 7 years of preparation and construction, everything was ready. The island was in place, the seawalls were complete, the terminal was finished, the runway was paved, all the infrastructure was installed, the airport could open. The total cost was astronomical. Estimates suggested that the entire project, from initial planning through construction, from island preparation through building the terminal, cost around $20 billion. $20 billion for a single airport. In the 1990s, that was an extraordinary sum of money. It was one of the most expensive construction projects in the history of human civilization. But the engineers believed it was worth it. They believed they had solved Osaka's problem. They believed they had created an airport that would serve the region for generations. They had geotechnical models that predicted how the island would settle. They had calculated subsidence rates. They had planned for the inevitable compression of the clay beneath the island. They had everything figured out. Or at least they thought they did. The engineers predicted that the island would sink about 13 feet over a 50-year period. That's roughly 3 inches per year. Slow, predictable, manageable. The structures were designed with flexibility to accommodate this gradual settling. Pipes and cables were installed in ways that could flex. Building connections were designed to move slightly without breaking. Everything was engineered with this slow subsidence in mind. The engineers had done their homework. They had used the best available geotechnical science. They had been as careful and precise as possible. The plan was straightforward. The island would settle gradually over decades. The airport would continue operating normally. And nobody would really notice any problems because the settling would be so slow and steady. That plan was about to encounter reality. In 1999, just 5 years after the airport opened, surveyors took measurements of the island's elevation. This was normal procedure. Engineers regularly measure infrastructure to track how it's performing. They use precision instruments so accurate they can measure changes down to the millimetre. The surveyors collected their data at various points across the island. They recorded the exact elevation of different locations. They compared these new measurements to the baseline measurements taken during construction. They were simply checking on how the island was settling, exactly as predicted. But when they analysed the numbers, something didn't match up. The engineers had predicted that by 1999, the island would have sunk about 2.5 feet. That was their forecast. That was what their geotechnical models said would happen. 2.5 feet of subsidence in 5 years. Slow, manageable, nothing to worry about, within the realm of normal expected behaviour. When the surveyors ran the actual measurements, they found that the island had sunk 26 feet. Not 2.5 feet, 26 feet. The actual subsidence was more than 10 times what had been predicted. In 5 years, the island had dropped more than 4 stories. It's hard to overstate how shocking this discovery was. Imagine building something, calculating how much it will sink, and then discovering it sinking 10 times faster than you predicted. This wasn't a small discrepancy. This wasn't a measurement error. This was a fundamental failure of prediction. The engineers went very quiet. There were meetings. There were reviews of the data. There were conversations about what this meant. The tone shifted from celebration to crisis. The airport that had just opened to worldwide acclaim was now facing a serious problem. Here's what made this situation so difficult. The airport couldn't shut down. They couldn't stop operations while they figured out what went wrong. Thousands of people were flying through the airport every day. Cargo was being loaded and unloaded. International flights were scheduled. The economy of the region depended on this airport functioning. You can't just close an airport that's critical infrastructure because you've discovered an engineering problem. The operation had to continue while engineers scrambled to understand what was happening. The immediate question was obvious. Why was it sinking so much faster than predicted? Engineers went back and reviewed everything. They studied the clay samples that had been collected during the planning phase. They looked at the records of the sand drain installation. They examined the documentation of the seabed preparation work. They tried to figure out where the prediction had gone wrong. What they discovered was complicated. There wasn't one single mistake. It was a combination of factors, all contributing to the problem. The sand drains, which were supposed to help consolidate the clay, hadn't been quite as effective as the models predicted. The clay itself seemed to have different compressibility characteristics than the geotechnical samples had suggested. The weight of the landfill and the infrastructure on top of it was creating stresses that pushed the clay down faster and harder than the calculations had accounted for. It was as if the clay beneath the island was behaving differently than anyone had expected. This raises a larger question about engineering and prediction. The engineers in the 1980s had used the best available science. They had the best geotechnical tools available at that time. They had studied samples of the clay, they had consulted with experts, but they still got it wrong. They had made an assumption about how the clay would behave, and reality didn't cooperate with that assumption. By 2000, the situation had become serious enough that it attracted international attention. Engineering journals started publishing papers analysing what had gone wrong at Kansai. The American Society of Civil Engineers sent researchers to study the problem. International media picked up the story. Newspapers around the world ran headlines about the world's most expensive airport sinking into the sea. There was a real question about whether Japan had made a catastrophic mistake. Should they have just expanded the old airport on land instead of building in the ocean? Was this going to become an abandoned airport? Would the infrastructure ultimately become unusable? The numbers told a frightening story. By 2001, 7 years after opening, the island had sunk about 31 feet total since construction began. By 2005, it had sunk roughly 37 feet. The initial rapid sinking rate had slowed somewhat, but it was still far faster than the original 13-foot prediction over 50 years. The island was sinking approximately 1 foot per year. That might not sound like much until you do the math. 1 foot per year for decades equals 30 feet in 30 years. 50 feet in 50 years. Here's why this matters. Runways need to be at a certain elevation. They need to be above sea level. They need to be above the highest storm surge that might occur during a typhoon. Kansai's runways were only about 12 to 15 feet above sea level. If the island keeps sinking at 1 foot per year, the runway isn't going to stay above water indefinitely. Eventually it will be underwater. The engineers could calculate approximately when that would happen. It wasn't an immediate emergency. But it was an emergency that was coming. Someday, in the not-too-distant future, if nothing changed, the runway would be submerged. This created a fundamental problem for the people responsible for the airport. The engineers couldn't solve this the way you solve most engineering problems. They couldn't redesign the seabed. They couldn't stop the clay from compressing. You can't make geology work faster or slower than it naturally does. Once a massive weight is placed on soft clay, the consolidation process is governed by the laws of physics. The water has to escape from between the clay particles. That takes time, years, decades. You can't accelerate it without potentially damaging the clay and making things worse. So the engineers faced a problem they literally couldn't solve. They could only manage it. And management meant making very difficult decisions about how to keep an operating airport functioning while its foundation was slowly collapsing. The first step was acceptance. The airport administration, the engineers and the government had to accept several uncomfortable truths. First, the island was going to keep sinking, probably for many more years, maybe for decades. Second, the original engineering models had been fundamentally wrong about something crucial. Third, this was now a long-term crisis that would require constant attention, constant monitoring, and constant innovation. But acceptance didn't solve the problem. It just created the framework for trying to manage it. The second step was figuring out, what do we actually do about this? How do you keep an airport operational when the ground beneath it is moving? When the foundation is shifting? When the runway is slowly disappearing into the earth? The airport administration consulted with engineers. They looked at various options. They could try to pump more water out of the clay to speed up consolidation. They could try to reinforce the seabed somehow. They could try to raise the island by adding more landfill material on top. None of these options were ideal. All of them were expensive. All of them had risks. But one option stood out as the most radical and the most potentially effective. What if you didn't try to stop the island from sinking? What if you accepted that it would sink? And instead, you lifted the building on top of the island as it sank. It's a crazy idea when you first think about it. You'd have to somehow raise an entire airport building, a mile-long structure weighing hundreds of thousands of tons, while keeping it operational, while planes are still landing on the runway, while thousands of passengers are still moving through the terminal, while baggage is still being handled and cargo is still being loaded. But as crazy as it sounded, this idea started to seem like the best option available, and in 2000, engineers began seriously planning how to implement it. The concept involved installing hydraulic jacks beneath the terminal building, industrial-scale jacks, hundreds of them, connected to massive concrete supports. These jacks would be capable of lifting sections of the building. And the raising could be done gradually, over time, in a controlled way, as the island continued to sink beneath it. This had never been done before at this scale. No airport, no major building of any kind had ever been continuously lifted to compensate for subsidence. It was a solution that would have to be invented specifically for this problem. It would require innovation. It would require precision engineering. It would require incredible coordination. But it seemed possible. And as the island kept sinking, keeping the building in place by lifting it started to look like the only viable option. The airport administration made the decision. They would build the most elaborate hydraulic jack system ever installed beneath a building. They would monitor the island's subsidence constantly. And as the island sank, they would raise the building. They would literally prevent the airport from disappearing. It was an extraordinary solution to an extraordinary problem, but it came with a price, an enormous price. Not just in money, but in complexity, in ongoing maintenance, in the permanent burden of managing a crisis that could never truly be solved. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable engineering efforts in modern history. An effort that would continue for decades. An effort that required innovation, persistence, and the willingness to spend hundreds of millions of dollars just to keep an airport in the same place as the ground beneath it slowly moved away. But that's the next part of the story. Here's the engineering problem reduced to its absolute simplest form. You have a building. The ground beneath it is sinking. You can't stop the ground from sinking because that's controlled by geology and physics. You can't move the building somewhere else because it's an airport and it needs to be where it is. You can't shut down the airport because the region depends on it. So what do? You lift the building. It's an answer so straightforward that it seems absurd, but sometimes the most elegant solutions are the ones that sound impossible until someone actually does them. And that's exactly what happened at Kansai International Airport. In the early 2000s, engineers began planning the most elaborate hydraulic jack system ever installed beneath any building. This would be unlike anything that had ever been attempted at this scale. They would install hundreds of hydraulic jacks, industrial-strength devices capable of lifting enormous weights directly beneath the passenger terminal. These jacks would be embedded in massive concrete supports. They would be connected to the building's structural system, and they would have one job: keep the building in roughly the same place as the island beneath it slowly disappeared. The scale of what they were proposing was staggering. The terminal building is a mile-long structure. It weighs hundreds of thousands of tons. It's sitting on 900 adjustable columns, each one capable of being raised or lowered individually using hydraulic pressure. The building wasn't resting permanently on these columns. The columns were designed to be flexible, designed to move, designed to accommodate subsidence. Here's how the system actually works in practice. And this is where the engineering brilliance becomes clear. Surveyors regularly measure the elevation of the artificial island at 17 different monitoring points spread across its surface. They use precision instruments that can measure subsidence down to the millimetre. Every few months they go out and take new measurements. They compare the new measurements to previous data. They create a detailed map of exactly how much each section of the island has sunk since the last measurement. Once they have this data, they know which parts of the building need to be raised, and by how much. Let's say they discover that the western section of the terminal has sunk 3 centimetres since the last adjustment, while the eastern section has sunk 2 centimetres. That difference matters. If you raise both sections equally, you'd create stress in the building. You'd be pulling it in different directions. You could crack it. You could damage the structure. So the engineers raise each section independently. They excavate carefully beneath the terminal building. Workers go underneath the structure in controlled conditions, removing earth and concrete. They locate the hydraulic jacks in the areas where subsidence has been measured. They insert iron plates beneath the jacks. Then they activate the hydraulic system. The jacks slowly raise that specific section of the building, just a few inches, slowly, carefully, raising it back to approximately where it needs to be. The coordination required for this process is extraordinary. Imagine trying to raise a mile-long building a few inches at a specific location without creating structural damage. The building is a living, functioning structure. Thousands of people are inside it at any given moment. Baggage is moving through conveyor systems. Electricity is flowing through cables. Water is flowing through pipes. Everything is connected. Everything is moving. If you raise one section too much while another section remains lower, you create tension in the concrete and steel that connects them. You create stress points. You risk cracking the structure. The engineers have to coordinate the raising with extreme precision. They monitor the building's structure in real time during the process. They have sensors throughout the building that measure stress in the concrete. They watch for any signs of strain or damage. They adjust the raising process if they detect problems. The first major hydraulic jack adjustment cycle happened in the early 2000s. It was technically successful. The building was raised. The island continued sinking. The building stayed in approximately the same location, but psychologically and operationally it was intense. The airport didn't shut down during the adjustments. Planes kept landing and taking off. Passengers kept moving through the terminal. Flights continued on schedule. Meanwhile, underneath, engineers were actively raising the building. They were engaging in controlled subsidence management while the airport was fully operational. Think about what that means. You're in a terminal, you're checking your luggage, you're heading to your gate. Somewhere beneath your feet, engineers are lifting a building, raising sections of concrete and steel, making adjustments to a structure that you're standing inside. The idea is unsettling. The execution is remarkable. What makes the hydraulic jack system so brilliant is that it's not a one-time fix. It's not a solution where you solve the problem once and then you're done. This is an ongoing process. The system is designed for permanent, continuous management. Every few years, the subsidence measurements are taken again. The new data shows how much more the island has sunk. Engineers plan the next round of adjustments. The cycle repeats. Measure, excavate, adjust, reseal. Measure, excavate, adjust, reseal. Over and over, year after year, decade after decade. This process will probably continue for as long as the airport operates. The cost of maintaining the system is substantial. Each adjustment cycle requires extensive engineering work. It requires excavation. It requires precision equipment. It requires skilled workers. It requires coordination with airport operations to minimize disruption. Each cycle costs tens of millions of dollars. The airport has conducted multiple major adjustment cycles since they began in the early 2000s. Some estimates suggest that the total cost of managing subsidence through hydraulic jacks since they were first installed could exceed $1 billion. $1 billion. Just to keep the building in roughly the same place while the island beneath it slowly sinks. But here's what's remarkable about this. It works. The airport continues to operate. It continues to function. The hydraulic jacks have proven that you can engineer your way through seemingly impossible problems if you're willing to be creative, innovative, and committed to solving them. The jacks didn't solve the underlying problem of clay consolidation. The island is still sinking, the clay is still compressing, the water is still escaping from between the clay particles. No amount of jacks can change those geological processes. But the jacks solved the practical problem, keeping the airport operational. They bought time. They demonstrated that even when reality diverges dramatically from engineering predictions, human ingenuity can find solutions. What makes the Kansai solution truly unique is that no other major airport in the world relies on this system. Not Singapore, not Hong Kong. Not any other airport that might be dealing with difficult terrain. Kansai is alone in this. Why? Because no other airport was built on a sinking island. Most airports are built on land that's either stable or has known, manageable settling patterns. Kansai had to invent a solution to a problem that, in the history of aviation, had never been solved before. The engineers at Kansai didn't have a playbook. They couldn't look at how other airports had handled this situation. They couldn't study similar cases. There were no similar cases. They had to create the playbook while the airport was operating, while millions of passengers were using it, while the economy of the region depended on it. The hydraulic jack system represents more than just an engineering solution. It represents a philosophy that you don't give up when reality doesn't match your predictions. You adapt, you innovate. You find creative ways to solve problems that conventional engineering wisdom says are unsolvable. But as the engineers settled into this new reality, a reality of continuous monitoring, regular adjustments, permanent maintenance, and enormous costs, something else was developing that they couldn't control with hydraulic jacks. Something that came not from below the island, but from above it. A threat that would expose a completely different vulnerability in the entire concept of building an airport on an artificial island in the middle of an ocean. In 2018, nearly 3 decades after the airport opened, that threat would arrive in the form of one of the strongest typhoons to hit Japan in decades. And it would reveal that subsidence, while dramatic and expensive to manage, might not be the most dangerous problem the airport faces. September the 4th, 2018. It's a date that matters because it marks exactly 24 years since Kansai International Airport opened. It's a date that would have been a good day to celebrate. The airport had been operating for nearly 3 decades. It had successfully dealt with the subsidence problem through extraordinary engineering solutions. It was handling nearly 30 million passengers annually. Everything was working. The hydraulic jacks were doing their job. The monitoring systems were functioning. The airport was stable. It was operating at full capacity. But on September 4th, 2018, something arrived that no amount of hydraulic jacks could prepare for. Typhoon Jebi. This wasn't an ordinary storm. This was one of the strongest typhoons to hit Japan in decades. Wind speeds exceeded 110 miles per hour. In some gusts, the wind reached even higher. Wave heights in Osaka Bay reached over 20 feet. These weren't small waves. These were enormous walls of water pushed toward the artificial island by the storm's power. The barometric pressure dropped so dramatically that seawater was physically pushed higher than normal sea level just from atmospheric pressure alone. It was one of those rare weather events where nature demonstrates its indifference to human engineering. Kansai Airport had weather monitoring systems. The engineers and airport operators had experience with typhoons. They'd weathered storms before. The seawalls had been designed to handle typhoons. There were protocols. There were safety procedures. In theory, the airport should have been prepared. But Typhoon Jebi revealed something that computer models and engineering simulations had underestimated. The ocean, when it gets sufficiently angry, doesn't cooperate with your predictions. It doesn't respect your calculations. Waves crashed over the seawalls. They didn't just splash over. They came in with such force that they breached the defences. The water that had been intended to be kept out got in. It poured onto the island. It flooded sections of the passenger terminal. The water seeped into areas where it was never supposed to reach. Electrical systems got wet. Equipment got corroded. The seawater, being salty, was particularly damaging to metal and electronics. But the immediate flooding, while serious, wasn't the worst part. A massive cargo ship, a vessel that had broken loose from its moorings in the harbour, was being pushed by the typhoon's winds and waves. The ship was carried directly toward the bridge that connected the artificial island to the mainland. This bridge is critical infrastructure. It's the only fixed connection between the island and the rest of Japan. Vehicles cross it, utilities run through it, data cables run through it. Everything needed to keep the airport functioning passes through that bridge. The cargo ship hit the bridge. The impact was catastrophic. The bridge was severely damaged. This wasn't a minor repair situation. The bridge was seriously compromised. For the first time in its operating history, Kansai International Airport became truly isolated from the mainland. The only ways to move between the island and the mainland now were by helicopter or by boat. The bridge was essentially unusable. This created a situation that airport planners had theoretically considered but never actually experienced. The airport was cut off. Thousands of passengers found themselves trapped on the island. These weren't passengers who had planned to be there. They weren't stranded hikers or sailors waiting out a storm. These were people who had boarded flights expecting to arrive at their destinations. They expected to fly in, pass through the airport, and leave. Instead, they found themselves on an isolated island in the middle of a typhoon, unable to leave because the bridge was damaged. One passenger told journalists, "We were trapped." That simple statement captured the terror and frustration of the moment. People had no control over the situation. They couldn't drive off the island. They couldn't just wait for the next flight because no flights were happening. The airport was in shutdown mode. Everything had stopped. Hotels on the island filled to capacity. People who couldn't find hotel rooms slept in the airport terminal. The airport's restaurants and shops, which were designed to serve transiting passengers, not people staying overnight, ran out of food. For several hours and then several days, Kansai International Airport wasn't functioning as an airport. It was functioning as a refugee camp. The airport remained shut down for 17 days. 17 days without flights. Hundreds of flights were cancelled. Thousands of passengers were stranded. The economic impact rippled far beyond the airport itself. Companies that depended on the airport for logistics couldn't move goods. Just-in-time manufacturing operations, which are critical to Japanese industry, were disrupted. Parts didn't arrive. Production lines stopped. The ripple effects extended across Japan's economy. When operations finally resumed, the cleanup was massive. Seawater had corroded metal equipment. Salt water had damaged electrical systems. Infrastructure that had been exposed to salt water needed restoration work. The terminal building had water damage. The runway needed inspection for damage. It took weeks to fully restore the airport to normal operations. One runway couldn't reopen for 10 days. The passenger terminal couldn't fully reopen for 17 days. But what made Typhoon Jebi significant, what made it more than just another disaster story, was what it revealed about the airport's future vulnerability. The engineers and planners at Kansai looked at what had happened, and they realised something uncomfortable. The airport had been designed in the 1980s and opened in the 1990s with specific weather thresholds in mind. Those thresholds were based on historical typhoon data from that era. They were based on sea level conditions as they existed in the 1990s. But the world was changing. Climate change wasn't a theoretical concern anymore. It was a practical reality affecting infrastructure. Typhoons were becoming stronger on average. Scientists studying tropical storm patterns were finding that the strongest typhoons were getting stronger. Sea levels were rising due to climate change. The ocean was expanding because water expands as it warms. Glaciers and ice sheets were melting, adding water to the oceans. The seawalls that had been designed to handle 1990s level storm surge might not be sufficient for the storm surge of the 2020s. The artificial island that had been engineered to handle extreme weather events based on 1980s and 1990s climate data was now facing weather conditions that exceeded those parameters. The island wasn't just under threat from below, from the sinking caused by clay consolidation. It was under threat from above, from increasingly powerful storms and rising sea levels. It was like the island was being squeezed from two directions simultaneously. From below, gravity and geology were pulling it down. From above, climate change was pushing the ocean higher and attacking it with stronger storms. Two different existential threats, both getting worse. Both interacting with each other in ways that made the problem more complicated than either threat alone would be. The bridge that had been damaged during Typhoon Jebi was rebuilt, but it was rebuilt to higher specifications. New barriers were constructed to protect it from ship impacts. New pumping systems were installed to handle surge water and drain water from the island more effectively. The seawall was evaluated and reinforcements were added in vulnerable areas. Additional water barriers were constructed. But all of these were reactive measures. They were responses to problems that Typhoon Jebi had revealed. The airport wasn't just vulnerable because of its sinking island foundation. It was vulnerable to a changing climate. And engineers realized that this changing climate wasn't going to stop or stabilize. It was going to keep getting worse. The question that had dominated thinking about the airport for decades, how much longer can we keep raising the building with hydraulic jacks, was suddenly supplemented by a different, more urgent question. How much longer can this island stay above water? These are two different questions with two different answers on two different timelines. The hydraulic jacks are an ongoing solution. They can theoretically continue indefinitely, or at least for as long as the building needs to be raised. But the island itself, the physical geography, the elevation above sea level, that's affected by forces beyond the airport's control. Subsidence is slow and manageable with engineering solutions. Climate change and rising seas are global phenomena that no local engineering project can reverse. For the first time, people started asking not just, how do we manage the sinking, but how long before this becomes fundamentally unsustainable? Not, when will the next adjustment be needed, but when will the ocean finally win? These questions would dominate conversations about the airport's future in the years after Typhoon Jebi. But the immediate flooding, while serious, wasn't the worst part. A massive cargo ship broke loose from its moorings in the harbour. The typhoon's winds and waves pushed it directly toward the bridge. This bridge connects the artificial island to the mainland. It's critical infrastructure. It's the only fixed connection between the island and the rest of Japan. Vehicles cross it. Utilities run through it. Data cables run through it. Everything needed to keep the airport functioning passes through that bridge. The cargo ship hit the bridge. The impact was catastrophic. The bridge was severely damaged. This wasn't a minor repair situation. The bridge was seriously compromised. For the first time in its operating history, Kansai International Airport became truly isolated from the mainland. The only ways to move between the island and the mainland now were by helicopter or by boat. The bridge was essentially unusable. This created a situation that airport planners had theoretically considered but never actually experienced. The airport was cut off. Thousands of passengers found themselves trapped on the island. These weren't passengers who had planned to be there. They weren't stranded hikers or sailors waiting out a storm. These were people who had boarded flights expecting to arrive at their destinations. They expected to fly in, pass through the airport and leave. Instead, they found themselves on an isolated island in the middle of a typhoon, unable to leave because the bridge was damaged. One passenger told journalists, "We were trapped." That simple statement captured the terror and frustration of the moment. People had no control over the situation. They couldn't drive off the island. They couldn't just wait for the next flight because no flights were happening. The airport was in shutdown mode. Everything had stopped. Hotels on the island filled to capacity. People who couldn't find hotel rooms slept in the airport terminal. The airport's restaurants and shops, which were designed to serve transiting passengers, not people staying overnight, ran out of food. For several hours and then several days, Kansai International Airport wasn't functioning as an airport. It was functioning as a refugee camp. The airport remained shut down for 17 days. 17 days without flights. Hundreds of flights were cancelled. Thousands of passengers were stranded. The economic impact rippled far beyond the airport itself. Companies that depended on the airport for logistics couldn't move goods. Just-in-time manufacturing operations, which are critical to Japanese industry, were disrupted. Parts didn't arrive. Production lines stopped. The ripple effects extended across Japan's economy. When operations finally resumed, the cleanup was massive. Seawater had corroded metal equipment. Salt water had damaged electrical systems. Infrastructure that had been exposed to salt water needed restoration work. The terminal building had water damage. The runway needed inspection for damage. It took weeks to fully restore the airport to normal operations. One runway couldn't reopen for 10 days. The passenger terminal couldn't fully reopen for 17 days. But what made Typhoon Jebi significant, what made it more than just another disaster story, was what it revealed about the airport's future vulnerability. The engineers and planners at Kansai looked at what had happened, and they realised something uncomfortable. The airport had been designed in the 1980s and opened in the 1990s with specific weather thresholds in mind. Those thresholds were based on historical typhoon data from that era. They were based on sea level conditions as they existed in the 1990s, but the world was changing. Climate change wasn't a theoretical concern anymore. It was a practical reality affecting infrastructure. Typhoons were becoming stronger on average. Scientists studying tropical storm patterns were finding that the strongest typhoons were getting stronger. Sea levels were rising due to climate change. The ocean was expanding because water expands as it warms. Glaciers and ice sheets were melting, adding water to the oceans. The seawalls that had been designed to handle 1990s level storm surge might not be sufficient for the storm surge of the 2020s. The artificial island that had been engineered to handle extreme weather events based on 1980s and 1990s climate data was now facing weather conditions that exceeded those parameters. The island wasn't just under threat from below, from the sinking caused by clay consolidation. It was under threat from above, from increasingly powerful storms and rising sea levels. It was like the island was being squeezed from two directions simultaneously. From below, gravity and geology were pulling it down. From above, climate change was pushing the ocean higher and attacking it with stronger storms. Two different existential threats, both getting worse, both interacting with each other in ways that made the problem more complicated than either threat alone would be. The bridge that had been damaged during Typhoon Jebi was rebuilt, but it was rebuilt to higher specifications. New barriers were constructed to protect it from ship impacts. New pumping systems were installed to handle surge water and drain water from the island more effectively. The seawall was evaluated and reinforcements were added in vulnerable areas. Additional water barriers were constructed. But all of these were reactive measures. They were responses to problems that Typhoon Jebi had revealed. The airport wasn't just vulnerable because of its sinking island foundation. It was vulnerable to a changing climate. And engineers realised that this changing climate wasn't going to stop or stabilise. It was going to keep getting worse. The question that had dominated thinking about the airport for decades changed. It used to be, how much longer can we keep raising the building with hydraulic jacks? But now there was a new, more urgent question. How much longer can this island stay above water? These are two completely different questions. They have two different answers and two different timelines. The hydraulic jacks are an ongoing solution. They can theoretically continue indefinitely, or at least for as long as the building needs to be raised. But the island itself, the physical geography, the elevation above sea level, that's affected by forces beyond the airport's control. Subsidence is slow and manageable with engineering solutions. Climate change and rising seas are global phenomena that no local engineering project can reverse. For the first time, people started asking not just How do we manage the sinking? But how long before this becomes fundamentally unsustainable? Not, when will the next adjustment be needed, but when will the ocean finally win? These questions would dominate conversations about the airport's future in the years after Typhoon Jebi. After Typhoon Jebi, something shifted at Kansai International Airport. It wasn't a sudden change. It was more like a realization that had been slowly building. But the typhoon made it impossible to ignore. The airport was no longer dealing with a single problem that could be managed with engineering solutions. It was dealing with multiple simultaneous crises that were all getting worse at the same time. Subsidence from below, climate change from above, rising sea levels, increasingly powerful storms. A changing world that didn't care about plans made in the 1980s. The question shifted. It wasn't, can we fix this anymore? That question had been answered years ago when they installed the hydraulic jacks. The question became, how do we live with this? How do we keep an airport operational in the face of permanent instability? The answer involved creating what amounts to a permanent crisis management infrastructure. The airport became a 24/7 monitored, continuously adjusted, intelligently managed engineering system. It's still an airport. Planes still land and take off. Passengers still move through the terminal. Baggage still gets handled. But underneath all of that, there's a constant effort to keep the infrastructure from failing. The foundation of this management system is monitoring. Sophisticated sensor networks were installed throughout the artificial island and the terminal building. These aren't simple measurement tools like old surveying instruments. These are systems that continuously collect data about subsidence, structural stress, water infiltration, and environmental conditions. The data flows 24/7 into computer systems that analyze it in real time. There are 17 primary monitoring points distributed across the island's surface. Each point has instruments that can measure elevation changes down to the millimeter. Think about that level of precision, a millimeter. The systems are so sensitive that they can detect the tiniest changes in elevation. This data is constantly being collected, analysed, and compared to historical baselines. Engineers can see exactly where the island is sinking, how fast it's sinking, and predict where it will sink next. But monitoring subsidence was only one part of the equation. The airport also had to actively manage water. Lots of water. The island sits in the ocean. During storms, waves push enormous amounts of water onto the island. Seawater infiltrates the ground through cracks and porous materials. Groundwater levels rise. Rain accumulates. Without active water management, the island would basically become waterlogged. It would turn into a swamp. That's not compatible with operating an airport. So Kansai installed a sophisticated pumping system. Pumps work constantly to redirect water that's pushed onto the island by waves and storms. Additional systems drain water from the airport's surface during heavy rains. The airport literally built a hydraulic management system for the entire island. They're treating the island like a living organism that needs constant care to function properly. Water comes in. Pumps move it out. Continuously. Every day. Beyond the pumps, engineers went deeper. They built underground water barriers, essentially massive concrete walls buried deep beneath the island's surface. These barriers were constructed at specific depths to prevent seawater from permeating deep into the island's ground. They help curb rising groundwater levels. They're another line of defence in the constant battle against water that wants to destroy the infrastructure. The combination of all these systems creates something that had never existed before in the aviation industry. A completely active, continuously maintained, perpetually adapted infrastructure system. The airport isn't just using its buildings, it's nursing them, managing them, keeping them alive through constant intervention. Maintenance cycles became routine. Every few years, surveyors measure the island at all 17 monitoring points. The data shows exactly where subsidence has occurred. Engineers analyse the data and plan the next hydraulic jack adjustments. Work crews then excavate beneath the terminal building. This excavation work is done carefully, methodically. They remove earth and concrete. They locate the hydraulic jacks. They insert iron plates. They activate the system to raise that section. Then they reseal everything. A few years later, they do it again. Measure, adjust, reseal. Measure, adjust, reseal. It becomes like a heartbeat. The same rhythm, over and over, keeping the airport functional. What's remarkable is that none of this disrupts normal airport operations. Planes still land and take off. The baggage system still works. Flights operate on schedule. From a passenger's perspective, nothing seems different. You wouldn't know that the building is being continuously maintained. You wouldn't know about the subsidence. You wouldn't know about the hydraulic jacks working beneath your feet. But the cost of this continuous maintenance is absolutely staggering. The initial installation of the hydraulic jack system cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Each subsequent adjustment cycle, and there have been multiple cycles, costs tens of millions of dollars. Engineers need to be paid, equipment needs to be rented or purchased, skilled workers need to be brought in. The airport needs to coordinate the work around flight operations. Each cycle is a major undertaking. The water management systems required billion-dollar investments. The monitoring infrastructure is expensive to maintain. Sensors need to be calibrated. Data systems need to be operated. The personnel needed to operate these systems, geotechnical engineers, structural engineers, technicians, surveyors, represent an ongoing operational expense. These aren't temporary costs. These aren't one-time investments. These are permanent. Some estimates suggest that the annual cost of managing Kansai's subsidence and climate risks could exceed $100 million per year. $100 million every single year, just to keep the airport from collapsing into the sea. That's on top of normal operating costs. That's in addition to what it costs to run an airport, maintaining runways, operating terminals, staffing facilities. To put this in perspective, that's roughly $350 per passenger. For every passenger who flies through Kansai, a portion of their ticket price goes toward managing the island's subsidence and maintaining the infrastructure systems that keep the airport above water. Most passengers never know this. They buy a ticket, fly to their destination, and never think about what's happening underneath the airport. But here's the remarkable part. It works. The airport continues to operate. It continues to function brilliantly. It handles 28 million passengers annually. It operates 24 hours a day. The baggage system still has never lost a piece of luggage. Flights come and go on schedule. From a passenger's perspective, everything is normal, perfect even. This is the hidden reality of modern infrastructure in an age of climate change and geological challenges. Most of the systems that keep civilization functioning are operating at their design limits or beyond. Bridges are carrying more traffic than they were designed for. Power grids are operating with less safety margin than historical standards allowed. Water systems are under stress from population growth and climate change. Dams are aging. Roads need constant repair. But at Kansai, the stress is visible. It's measurable. It's tracked. It's managed. The airport is like a patient in intensive care. It's alive, it's functioning, but it requires constant medical attention. Remove that attention, and the patient would fail very quickly. The question that haunts everyone at Kansai, the engineers, the managers, the planners, is, for how long can this continue? The hydraulic jacks have physical limits. At some point, they'll be raised as high as they can go. There are only so many times you can excavate beneath a building and raise sections before you reach practical limits. The pumping systems can only handle a certain amount of water. If storms get more intense, if rainfall gets heavier, at some point the pumps won't be able to keep up. The underground barriers can only prevent so much saltwater intrusion. The seawalls can only protect against so much wave action. The monitoring systems are remarkable. They can predict the future based on current trends. But prediction isn't the same as prevention. You can know exactly when a problem will occur, but that doesn't mean you can stop it from happening. Something is eventually going to have to give. The only question is when, not if. When? Engineers and planners at Kansai have begun having conversations about long-term scenarios, not in public, not in media statements, But in meetings and planning sessions, they're asking, what happens in 30 years, 40 years, 50 years? At what point does the cost of maintaining the airport exceed what society is willing to spend? At what point do the physical limits of the engineering solutions get reached? At what point does it become more economical to build a new airport somewhere else than to keep investing in this one? These aren't comfortable conversations, these are conversations about eventual defeat, but they're necessary conversations, because eventually this airport will have to face reality. The ocean will win. The question is how long it takes and what Japan does about it when that moment arrives. For now, the systems keep working, the pumps keep running, the monitoring sensors keep collecting data, the engineers keep adjusting the hydraulic jacks, the airport keeps operating. Passengers arrive, depart, and never realise they're standing on one of the most carefully managed pieces of infrastructure on the planet. An airport built to solve a crisis that created a different ongoing crisis. A crisis that requires constant management just to prevent complete failure. It's engineering at its limits. It's human problem solving in the face of planetary scale challenges. It's a working example of how to keep something functioning when nature is slowly taking it apart. In 2015, 7 years after Typhoon Jebi battered the airport and revealed the climate vulnerability, a team of American engineers from MIT and several other universities published a study about Kansai International Airport's future. The study made news around the world. International engineering journals covered it, news outlets picked it up, and it made news for a reason that nobody at the airport particularly wanted to discuss. It projected a specific date when the airport would become completely unusable. The American engineers analysed all the available subsidence data from 1994, when the airport opened, through 2015. They looked at the sinking rates in different areas of the artificial island. They examined historical data on sea level rise. They factored in climate change projections from the major international organisation that studies climate science. They ran complex mathematical models that tried to predict what would happen over the next several decades if current trends continued, and they came to a conclusion that was uncomfortable, specific, and hard to ignore. Based on current subsidence rates and projected sea level rise from climate change, at least one of Kansai's 2 runways could become submerged by around the year 2058. 43 years from the time the study was published, 2 generations from now. If current trends continue, 1 runway would be underwater by 2058. It's a specific prediction, not sometime in the distant future, not at some point this might happen. The year 2058. That's the deadline. That's when, according to the calculations, the water wins. Immediately after the study was published, Japanese airport officials criticised it. They argued that the American researchers hadn't adequately accounted for the mitigation measures that Japan had already implemented. They said the models were too pessimistic. They pointed out that the subsidence rate had actually slowed somewhat in recent years, as the clay continued to consolidate. The clay that had been compressing rapidly in the early 2000s had stabilised somewhat. The sinking rate was slower than it had been. The Japanese officials weren't wrong about any of this. The American study didn't fully account for the hydraulic jacks, the water management systems, or the other innovations that had been implemented to slow the sinking. The study was somewhat pessimistic, but here's what matters about the 2058 projection. It wasn't made up, it wasn't guessing, it was based on real data, real physics, real measurements of how much the island has sunk and how fast it's sinking. And when the New York Times asked officials from Kansai whether they thought the airport could operate indefinitely, they didn't say yes. They said something much more careful. They said that climate change could accelerate the timeline, that rising sea levels were happening faster than some earlier projections had suggested, that extreme weather events were becoming more common, that the situation was more complicated than simple subsidence calculation suggested. That's not an answer that inspires confidence. It's a careful, honest answer from people who understand that they're fighting a losing battle. Not today, not in the next 5 years, not even in the next 10 years, but eventually. At some point, the amount of money and engineering ingenuity required to keep the airport operational is going to exceed what society is willing to spend. Or the physical limits of the hydraulic jacks will be reached. Or the seawalls won't be sufficient for storm surge in a changed climate. Or some combination of all these factors will make the operation of the airport no longer feasible. The 2058 timeline raises uncomfortable questions that planners and engineers at Kansai have started to seriously consider. If one runway is underwater by 2058, what does that mean for the airport's operations? An airport needs at least one usable runway to function as an airport. You can't land planes without a runway. If one of the two runways is submerged, the airport's capacity is cut roughly in half. The airport could technically still operate with a single runway, but it would be severely limited. A single runway means fewer flights per hour. Fewer flights means fewer passengers can be handled. Fewer passengers means less economic value. In a region like Osaka, which depends heavily on air travel for economic vitality, an airport operating at half capacity is barely worth operating. So the question becomes, what happens if that occurs? Does Japan spend whatever enormous amount of money is necessary to keep both runways above water? Does that involve raising the island itself further, building even higher seawalls, installing even more sophisticated hydraulic systems and pumping infrastructure? The cost would be astronomical. We're talking potentially tens of billions of dollars in additional investments just to delay the inevitable by a few more decades. And here's the uncomfortable part. At some point, you have to ask whether that's rational. At what point does it become more economically logical to build a new airport on land near Osaka and gradually shift operations away from Kansai, rather than continuing to invest endless money in a sinking island? Some engineers and planners at Kansai are already having quiet conversations about what comes next. These aren't public discussions. These are internal planning conversations about scenarios and possibilities. Some proposals involve massive reclamation projects to raise the island's elevation further. Imagine dumping more landfill material onto the island, like they did during construction, but on a much larger scale to raise the entire thing higher. Other proposals involve building new seawalls that are even higher and more sophisticated. Some involve creating a completely new airport on land near Osaka and gradually shifting operations away from Kansai over the course of several years. Some involve accepting that Kansai will eventually have to close and planning accordingly. But all of these are just proposals, plans for futures that may or may not happen. Nobody knows which path Japan will ultimately choose. Climate change adds another layer of complexity to all these calculations. Sea level rise isn't consistent, it's accelerating. The major international organizations studying climate change projects that sea levels could rise by 3 to 4 feet by the end of the century, depending on the scenario. That's a lot of rise. But that's not counting storm surge during typhoons, which is a separate phenomenon. Storm surge is when the ocean is physically pushed higher than normal sea level by the pressure of a typhoon's winds and low barometric pressure. 3 to 4 feet of additional sea level rise from climate change, combined with the storm surge that could occur during a major typhoon, creates extreme situations. 3 to 4 feet of additional sea level rise, combined with subsidence that might total another 15 to 20 feet by 2100, as the clay continues to consolidate, means that the island is potentially facing a total change in elevation of 20 to 25 feet relative to sea level over the course of this century. That's enormous. That's not manageable through incremental adjustments to hydraulic jacks and seawalls. That would require fundamental reconstruction of the entire infrastructure. The 2058 timeline represents a kind of halfway point, not the end of the airport, but the beginning of the end. Up until 2058, according to the American study, the airport is still functional. Both runways are still above water. Operations continue. After 2058, the situation changes. After 2058, you're not just maintaining infrastructure in an unusual situation. You're fighting to keep operational an airport that's fundamentally becoming incompatible with its location. And at some point, that fight becomes unwinnable, At some point, you have to accept reality and make a different choice. What makes this situation unique is that the decision about Kansai's future isn't just an engineering problem. It's not a question that can be solved with more sophisticated hydraulic jacks or higher seawalls. It's an economic problem. It's a political problem. It's a question about how much a society should invest in maintaining infrastructure in an increasingly hostile location. It's a question about climate adaptation. It's a question about the limits of human engineering in the face of planetary scale changes. It's a question about whether you keep investing in something you know eventually cannot be saved, or whether you accept reality and move forward. All of these questions are converging on Kansai International Airport, and they're going to force difficult decisions in the coming decades. Japan is going to have to decide, do we keep spending hundreds of millions of dollars every year to keep this airport alive? Do we build a new airport elsewhere? Do we try some combination of both? Do we accept that Kansai will eventually close? Nobody knows the answer yet. The year 2058 is still over 30 years away. A lot can change in 30 years. Technology could advance in unexpected ways. Climate scenarios could be better or worse than current projections. Japanese society's priorities could shift. The economic importance of the Osaka region could change, but regardless of what happens, the deadline is there. The date is there. 2058. The year when, according to current projections, one runway will be underwater. For now, the airport operates. Planes land and take off. Passengers move through the terminal. Engineers adjust the hydraulic jacks. Pumps keep running. Everything continues. But everyone involved knows that this is temporary. This is a holding pattern. This is buying time. And time, unfortunately, is what's running out. Here's something that most people don't know about Kansai International Airport. Its greatest impact might not be the airport itself. It might not be about flying planes or handling passengers or managing baggage with perfect efficiency. The greatest impact of Kansai might be what the airport has taught the world about building in difficult places, managing infrastructure under extreme conditions, and adapting when reality doesn't cooperate with your plans. When Japan completed Kansai in 1994, it had solved a practical problem for Osaka. It had created a new airport in a location where expansion was impossible. It had moved airport operations away from residential neighborhoods. It had achieved something remarkable, building on an artificial island in the middle of the ocean. For a moment, Kansai was celebrated as a triumph of engineering, a monument to what was possible. But when Kansai started experiencing subsidence problems, when the island began sinking much faster than predicted, something unexpected happened. The crisis became valuable. The problem became a learning opportunity. Kansai became what amounts to a massive, real-time, 3-decade-long experiment in what happens when human engineering encounters geological reality. Every problem that Kansai faced, every solution it developed, every unexpected challenge it discovered, all of that knowledge was captured, documented, studied, and shared with the rest of the world. Engineers from around the globe came to Kansai to study what was happening, not to celebrate success, but to learn from crisis. Universities used Kansai as a case study in geotechnical engineering courses. The airport became a textbook, written in concrete and steel, about the complexities of building on soft seabed. Professional organizations published papers about Kansai's subsidence management. The American Society of Civil Engineers studied the airport. International engineering conferences featured presentations about the hydraulic jack system. Researchers analysed the monitoring data. The airport became openly discussed in the engineering community as an example of what happens when prediction fails, and you have to innovate under pressure. That knowledge became invaluable when Japan decided to build another artificial island airport. In 2005, Chubu Centre International Airport opened in Kansai Bay. It faced similar challenges to Kansai. The seabed had soft clay. The location was in a typhoon-prone region. The challenges were fundamentally similar. The problems were the same, but because of what Kansai had experienced, the engineers designing Chubu Centre could avoid Kansai's mistakes. They could learn from Kansai's struggles, They designed the seabed treatment differently, based on lessons learned at Kansai. They incorporated hydraulic jack technology into the design from the beginning, rather than adding it reactively after the building had already sunk. They installed more sophisticated monitoring systems from day one. They designed higher seawalls and more resilient infrastructure. They understood the risks because Kansai had already encountered them. Chubu Centrair is a more sophisticated airport than Kansai, in large part because Kansai had already encountered and solved many of the problems that would face another artificial island airport. In a way, Kansai's struggles became Chubu Centrair's inheritance. The problems that nearly overwhelmed Kansai became routine engineering challenges for Chubu Centrair because the lessons had been learned. The knowledge was transferred. The experience was applied. Beyond Japan, engineers designing major infrastructure projects around the world have studied Kansai. Planners building ports in difficult terrain have looked at how Kansai solved subsidence. Reclamation projects in other countries have examined Kansai's approaches. Airport designers in countries facing similar challenges, limited land availability, soft seabeds, environmental constraints, have studied Kansai's engineering solutions. The airport became an open textbook for how to build in increasingly difficult environments. China studied Kansai when building artificial islands. Dubai looked at the solutions. Vietnam, which faces similar coastal challenges, examined what happened at Kansai. The airport's experiences are now part of the global knowledge base for infrastructure engineering. When a country faces the problem of building on difficult terrain, engineers look at Kansai. They learn from what worked. They learn from what didn't. The story of Kansai also resonates with a larger conversation about adaptation and resilience. In an era of climate change, in a world where sea levels are rising and extreme weather events are intensifying, infrastructure designed to be static and permanent is becoming increasingly obsolete. The old model, build it once, maintain it minimally, expect it to last forever, doesn't work anymore. Infrastructure designed for 1980s weather conditions isn't sufficient for 2020's weather conditions. Infrastructure that can adapt, that can respond to changing conditions, that can be maintained and adjusted continuously. That's the future. Kansai pioneered this kind of adaptive infrastructure at a scale and complexity that no one had attempted before. The hydraulic jacks, the monitoring systems, the water management infrastructure, these aren't just responses to Kansai's specific problems. They're examples of how future infrastructure might need to be designed to function in a changing world. Think about it. Most buildings and infrastructure are built and then left alone. You maintain them. You repair them when they break. But you don't continuously adjust them. Kansai does. The building is continuously adjusted to accommodate subsidence. The island is continuously monitored. Water is continuously managed. The infrastructure is alive in a way that most infrastructure isn't. It's dynamic. It responds. It adapts. This philosophy of adaptive infrastructure is going to become more important as climate change accelerates. Dams will need to be adjusted as rainfall patterns change. Coastal infrastructure will need to be raised as sea levels rise. Power grids will need to be reconfigured as weather patterns shift. Highways will need constant maintenance as temperature extremes increase. The static, permanent infrastructure model is dying. The adaptive, continuously managed model is becoming the future, and Kansai is a pioneer of that approach. There's also a philosophical dimension to Kansai's legacy. The airport stands as a monument to human ambition and problem solving. A city that couldn't expand its existing airport didn't accept that limitation. It said, "Let's build in the ocean." When that building started sinking faster than predicted, the airport didn't accept disaster. It said, "Let's invent hydraulic jacks." When a typhoon revealed new vulnerabilities, the airport didn't give up. It said, "Let's build higher seawalls and better drainage systems." The airport is a testament to persistence in the face of obstacles, but it's also a cautionary tale. It's a story about the limits of engineering. It's a story about unintended consequences. It's a story about the costs in money, in resources, in perpetual maintenance, of fighting against nature instead of adapting to it. It's a story about how solving one problem can create another problem that's just as serious. The airport solved Osaka's noise and congestion problem, but in doing so, it created a sinking island problem that requires endless effort to manage. Every day, tens of thousands of passengers pass through Kansai International Airport. 28 million passengers annually. Most of them have no idea about any of this. They land. They go through the terminal. Their baggage arrives perfectly. They leave. The airport works seamlessly from a passenger's perspective. Everything feels normal, stable, permanent. But underneath, a constant engineering effort is happening. Surveyors measuring, hydraulic systems adjusting, water pumps running, monitoring sensors collecting data. The airport is alive in a way that most buildings aren't. It's not a static structure. It's a dynamic system, constantly adapting to its environment, constantly being maintained, constantly fighting against the forces that want to pull it down. And that might be Kansai's greatest lesson, that the future is going to require this kind of intelligent, adaptive infrastructure. It's going to require continuous monitoring. It's going to require flexibility. It's going to require a willingness to invest continuously in maintenance and adaptation. It's going to require accepting that some of the problems we build today won't have permanent solutions, only management strategies. It's going to require acknowledging that infrastructure will need to be continuously adjusted as the world changes. Kansai teaches that lesson on a 4-square-kilometre island in Osaka Bay, with hydraulic jacks and millions of sensors and billions of dollars in investments. But the lesson applies to infrastructure everywhere. The world is changing, the climate is changing, sea levels are rising, weather is becoming more extreme. The infrastructure we build today is going to have to change with it. It's going to have to adapt, it's going to have to be flexible, it's going to require constant care and attention. Kansai shows us what that looks like. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without compromise, but it shows us that it's possible. It shows us how to keep something functioning in an increasingly hostile environment. That's the legacy of Kansai International Airport. Not just that it's an impressive airport, not just that it's built on an artificial island, not just that it's sinking. The legacy is that it's a pioneer of adaptive, resilient, continuously maintained infrastructure. It's a model for how to keep something functioning in an increasingly hostile environment. It's a textbook written in real time about the challenges and possibilities of engineering in the 21st century, and whether the airport ultimately succeeds in its long-term mission, or whether it eventually becomes submerged, whether Japan builds a new airport on land or continues investing in Kansai. The lessons it's teaching right now, in real time, in this moment, are going to shape how the world thinks about infrastructure for decades to come. The airport is writing the manual for how to build and maintain critical infrastructure in a changing world, and that manual is going to be studied and applied long after Kansai itself is gone.